You're listening to the Moose and the Loose, your 10 minutes action-packed financial podcast with your host, Mikey Hu. Hey, what's up, Market Moose? Welcome to Retirement Friday. I hope you are doing well. Last week on Retirement Loop, we got a very interesting discussion about which kind of inflation rates you should use in your retirement planning. And inflation is a very key topic when you are working on your retirement plan. Why? Because once you retire, you kind of lose the ability to generate more cash flow, right? You're going to depend on your pension plan, CPP, OAS, your portfolio mostly, and all of that. Well, besides your portfolio that may go up or may go down depending on how you invest and your strategy, everything is subject to inflation. And this number of how cost of living increase or not, depending on people, could have a crazy impact on your portfolio and your retirement plan. And just to show you how it works is imagine that you retire at the age of 60 with a budget of $4,000 a month. So $48,000 a year. And then, well, if you're 60, you retire on that, chances are you're going to live until 90, 95, maybe 100 years old. So you need to make sure that you have enough money, right? So if you pull out any financial projection tool and you look at your budget of $48,000 and see what's going to happen if I use a 2% inflation rate and I'm now 75. So 15 years down the road. So not even going to like 85 or 90 years old, but really to 75. So from 60 to 75, you're going to go from a budget of $48,000 up to 64.6, so almost 65 grand. That's up almost $17,000 just by using a 2% inflation over 15 years. Now, 2% could be debatable, right? And we're going to get there in a second. But just to continue with this example, like let's say you want to be on the safe side and say, well, I'm not going to count for 2%. I'm going to count for 3% inflation rate. Well, 3% inflation rate, your budget goes from 48K to 74.7. So almost $75,000. Crazy, right? That's a $27,000 difference between the age of 60 and the age of 75. Is your portfolio able to take that kind of hit? I mean, I don't know, but that's kind of crazy, right? That's just the difference between 2 and 3%. We're talking about $10,000 more to spend after 15 years. And here's the kicker. If you go all in on inflation and use a 4% inflation rate, which is very high according to standards, right? Well, then your budget goes from 48 to 86.5. That's a $38.5 thousand, almost $39,000 difference in 15 years. So you can see that between spending $65,000 with a 2% inflation rate and 87 with a 4% inflation rate, there's a huge difference. We're talking about like more than $20,000 gap. It's almost about $10,000 per percent over 15 years, and still at the age of 75, chances are you're still healthy and you're still doing a lot of things. And you probably have like another 15 years to go easily. So that could be a problem if you have not planned accordingly, right? So going back to which kind of number should you use? Different sorts of calculations, different angles. This is what I want to talk about today. The discussion on Retirement Loop has been very great, and I'm actually working on a project that's called the 5 retirement upgrades you can do to boost your budget, kind of like to beat that kind of inflation and making sure that you're on the safe side. If you are not part of Retirement Loop, you could go to moosemarkets.com/retirement, moosemarkets.com/retirement. Subscribe to the waitlist there, and you're going to receive that 5 upgrades. They were already discussed at Retirement Loop a while ago during a private webinar, but I want to share you some of the stuff that we do before we reopen the doors. So moosemarkets.com/retirement. So going back to inflation now, Bank of Canada, its target is 2% for inflation rate. And over the past 10, 20, 25 years, pretty much on target, right? Yes, we add some years of inflation. We just went through like 3 years of crazy inflation, 21, 22, 23, even 24, actually, 4 years, right? Today in 25, we're probably going to go back to that 2%. Like that's pretty much what's happening. So in financial planning, if you use Financial FP Canada, Financial Planning Canada, for example, or Institution des planificateurs financiers du Québec for my French fellows, you're going to see that for projections, they suggest an inflation rate of around 2%, 2.10, I think, right now. So what's behind that? The thinking about behind it? Well, quite simple. Since it's the target of the Fed on the US and the Bank of Canada on our side, chances are we're going to have an inflation of about 2% for a very long time. This is what is being targeted. The problem is calculation, right? There are justified criticism around how the Bank of Canada calculate and track inflation. And I totally agree with that. It's actually quite different if you go with other perspective. There's an institution in the U.S. called Shadow Stats. Shadow Stats are using a whole new different set of calculations and gets an inflation rate around like 8 or 9% for last year in the U.S., which the Fed is definitely not agreeing with that. So what to make sense of that? Like, should we go with an inflation of 8% and going back into the 80s? I think it's a bit overkill. And keep in mind, you're gonna say, oh, what happened if we go through another period where it's like the same thing in the 80s? I'm like, all right, but the 80s did the 80s, like the situation with a high inflation rate, a high interest rate, lasted for 30, 35 years? No, it didn't. So it was really bad for a few years, but not for like 30 years of your retirement. So you have to keep that into consideration. And keep in mind, the inflation is calculated using the average of a basket of goods, but maybe you don't spend those a big part of your budget into those kind of goods. Like for example, I don't smoke, so tobacco for me not an issue. If I don't plan to sell my house for another 25 years and I want to live there and retire there, cost of housing not going to increase for me because I'm still paying the same price, like it's just my mortgage, and the mortgage is not going according to inflation. It will only change if I'm renting or if I want to buy and sell my house like several times and then change all the time. And even then, the house that I'm selling right now would have benefited from the inflation. So technically, the mortgage amount would be about the same unless I'm trying to always increase the value of my house and upsize always the house value. But if I stay the same, that's not going to affect my portfolio, my budget. But if the inflation counts, I don't know, like 10 or 5 or 20% of someone's budget going to housing, and that housing goes up by like 5 or 6% a year, I'm not affected by this. So the solution here is to calculate your own inflation based on the basket of goods that you are spending. If you are a big traveler and traveling costs increase by 10%, well, then that will have a major impact on your budget as well. So it's more important to know a little bit more about your personal situation. Personally, I still go with the Bank of Canada's target at 2% in FP Canada, mostly because I also use a very low rate of return. For the equity part, I plan with under 7% a year, even though I've been investing since 2003 and showed an analyzed growth rate for my portfolio above 13% for the past 21 years. And yet I still plan with 6.5% return on my equity side. Why am I doing this? I want to be on the conservative side. So I'm maybe using an inflation that is a little bit too low, but the expected return is also a little bit too low. So that's going to equal out. The best solution here is really to play around with a financial projection tool where you can run multiple scenarios to have kind of like a upper limit and a lower limit to your budget. So you know what is the range depending on what happens when you play around with the expected returns of your portfolio, whatever happens when you play around with inflation. And of course, For in this example, if you go with a $48,000 budget, well, 2% inflation goes to 65, 4% goes to 87. So you're going to have to fund your retirement somewhere 65 and 87. That's you're 100% sure that you're going to be on target with this kind of number. So then, are you able to do that? Does it make sense, or will you have to adjust your budget and be a little bit more agile? Those are questions you have to ask yourself while you're doing your financial projections. So once again, if you want to have the 5 retirement upgrades, things that are under your control and you can take action today, I'm working on it. It's not completed yet. You can go to moosemarkets.com/retirement, subscribe to the newsletter, and you're going to receive that 5 upgrades guide as soon as it's live. For those that are subscribed to Retirement Loop already, you have the complete webinar that I've discussed those upgrades that was in January. So you have like an hour-long webinar with questions and stuff. A lot more information for you guys. So, all right, Moose, that's enough for today. We're going to come back on Monday with more investing topics. And until then, don't forget to stay invested.
Hey, welcome to the disclaimer. If you're listening to The Moose and the Loose, you cannot really expect me to give you buy or sell recommendation or financial advice, right? You're here for fun, you're here for information and some entertainment. But I am not your financial advisor, I am not your broker, so therefore I'm not liable if you're losing money after listening to the podcast. If you're looking for some advice, go see a professional. If not, you can enjoy the show and do your due diligence after it.